In this chapter, we are going to talk about mutual funds, which is one of the central ways that many people interact with the financial system. It's one of the easiest ways to interact with the financial system. So let's talk about it. So in essence, what a mutual fund, if what a mutual fund does is it's basically active investing. It's active investing by a professional towards a goal. So let's look at one of the earliest mutual funds out there. It's by MFS. Let's just see what was in it. I know there's this interesting kind of description of what used to be in it. I mean, they say it goes back to 1774, but I mean, come on, like, we're basically looking here at early 1920s here in the United States, 1924 at least, according to this. So in Massachusetts Investors Trust, I'm not sure if it's going to let us look at when there's the Wellington Fund. I forgot about that. The Wellington Fund in 1929. So what these funds do, sorry, I'm not trying to distract you. I just want to give you kind of a one set of mutual funds, for instance, that my wife sells a great deal of for regular retail investors, would be from this company called American Funds, which is based I think out of California, if I'm not mistaken. I just want to see if it's going to give me, if it allows me to see a list of different funds that are available. Oh, you really don't want to tell me the different funds that are available. Okay, well, then I'm gonna go to the classics. Sorry, I'm really just trying to give a good set of examples here. So TIAA-CREF, which I talked about in the previous lecture, it also has a long history of offering mutual funds. As the description is here, a mutual fund is kind of a curated list of something. Now, it doesn't have to be just stocks. It could be bonds. It could be stocks and bonds, stocks and bonds and cash. Somehow those are, you pick particular stocks, you pick particular bonds, or you pick a particular combination of the two to achieve some objective. The objective becomes important. But keep in mind that how a company thinks it can achieve that objective through bonds and stocks might not align with how you think it can be achieved. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So let's look at some of these here, just as an example here. So what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is a list of various mutual funds that have a title, meaning that it's trying to reach a certain objective. So let's start with this first one here, the TIAA-CREF Emerging Markets Equity Fund. What that would mean, as the title implies, is that it is investing in stocks in emerging markets. Now, the unseasoned investor is going to make a decision based on that title. But one thing I really, really, really want you to get out of this lecture is that title, you can name it whatever you want. Well, you can't name it whatever you want, but you get the idea. How you define an emerging market there is no objective way of how you define an emerging market, nor is there a way even of how I would define an equity. So let's get into this, at least for this one here. So when we're talking about emerging market equity funds, people get this notion of like, oh, I'm like investing in these like hot growing economies in Southeast Asia, and these stocks are just like exploding in size. Is that the case? Well, let's look and see. As I said, looks like in my emerging markets equity fund, 1% of the assets are actually in US equities. Okay. Another 2.28% is in things other than stocks, and then the rest is in international equity. So okay, so it basically does meet the definition of at least the equities part of emerging markets equity fund. Now let's see where it is. It is overwhelmingly in Asia Pacific. Let's look at it by country. It's overwhelmingly in China, then Korea, then Brazil, India, and Hong Kong. China is an emerging market, but it's a very mature emerging market. So the idea that you're getting in on the ground floor is certainly not the case. And where is it invested? Dude, Samsung Electronics? We're talking South Korea here. South Korea is not exactly an emerging market. South Korea is a highly developed economy. If it hasn't reached developed economy status, got to be pretty darn close. Alibaba, dude, you could buy Alibaba in a number of different ways. This would be a pretty bad way to invest in it. See, the point of why I say that is because you're paying a lot of money in terms of expenses to buy this mutual fund, like trying to depict the knowledge of the person that's picking this investment. And all they're doing, my critique of this, and I'm looking at this for the first time, so I could be wrong here, but all that fancy professional is doing is saying, oh, China's an emerging market. What are some of the biggest equities that I think might grow quite a bit? Alibaba was obviously one of them. That is their top holding. I don't think that's what people thought they were going to be getting into. Again, most individuals I think that are investing in an emerging market equity fund think they're more getting into like these Pyramol Enterprises or Cia Brasilia de Distributio, right? I mean, they're thinking of like getting into these companies that none of us have heard of, and all of a sudden they're going to like blow it out of the water and really grow strong. Alibaba is not that. Neither is Samsung. Now, again, nice thing about the US and the 1933 Securities Act is we have information to everything that they're invested in. JD.com, I think that's that like dating website, I think. When I say it like that, it makes it sound like I have no idea what people do. I think it is a not going to sound weird if it's not, but thought it was a collection of dating websites. Nope, it's actually the China's largest online retailer. It says by also does looks like it does package um, um, processing, order processing. What was the company I was thinking of then? Now I'm going to type in dating company, United States. My wife is going to be like totally pissed. Um, I was thinking of Match Group. So it was Match Group, but what's its ticker? MTCH. Okay, so I was off. Wynn Resorts, yes, they have a lot of exposure in Macau. Yes, so it's obviously in an emerging market, but Wynn Resorts is not is not what I think people thought they were getting into. Walmart of Mexico, dude. I mean, uh, what else? Okay, Treasury bills. That's not too odd. Budweiser Brewing Company, again, is that what people thought they were getting into? I'm not entirely sure that that's the case. So, I actually think that in my here's my personal sense, and this is just my own personal sense of things. If my wife has a client who knows that they need to save money and that they know that and that person knows that they need to use the markets to be able to save reasonably for things, yeah, doesn't have um, the time to invest in learning about the different equities that are out there, or seems really unsure of things. And for my wife, right, they have a rather small amount of funds. My wife typically would put that kind of client into a mutual fund because what it does is it gives the clients a great deal of diversity. It's not very cost efficient and it's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution. But if you have a portfolio, let's say of $100,000 and greater, you probably don't want to be using mutual funds. And the reason why you wouldn't want to be using mutual funds to do this is because of the cost. So look at the cost here. The net expenses are 1.27%. That would be what you are paying to be in this mutual fund. A lot of it being, part of it being commissioned to, the advisor, but also it just goes for the fancy people that are making that Alibaba decision. When an individual has enough money, it's cheaper for them just to directly invest in Alibaba. Nothing stops a person from just directly and looking at that list of all the things and just directly investing in those things, except the cost to doing so, and then having to watch things. It depends on how actively managed this fund is. Okay, let's go back to the slides. So again, the mutual fund, it is the mutual fund has a ticker symbol. It is traded on the exchanges, but it actually owns then a variety of other stocks. That is the nature of the so I know an American fund ticker symbol is CIBCX. So that would be the ticker symbol for the mutual fund, but contained within that mutual fund are hundreds of stocks. So with a mutual fund, instead of buying all those hundreds of stocks positions, you just buy CIBCX and you get instant access to everything that's in that portfolio. A great deal of people own mutual funds. I myself own some mutual funds. Um, Not particularly. Um, uh, I don't spend a particularly large amount of my time thinking about them. Um, and I try not to use them as much as possible, but I mean, they're there. You know, I have enough assets at this point that I'd rather just build something myself. Um, but again, if you don't have a lot of assets under $100,000, it's an excellent way at least to get some exposure to the markets. And yes, they are popular. There are risks to owning mutual funds, just like anything, any investment. Um, the concern for me always with like a client of my wife's or for any client in a mutual fund would primarily be oriented around the investor thinking that they're buying one thing, but they're actually getting another. Because let me talk to you a little bit about my, not that you're taking this class to learn about my gripes about the world. In general, I am a happy person, but I don't know, maybe, I don't know, maybe COVID's just made me a grumpier person with the nature of humanity. Because, dude, the world's a pretty shitty place sometimes, don't you think? Um, but there's good things too. Let's not get, all negative. I mean, there's excellent things out there. Um, that's someone saying, well, like, what shining? Don't ask me. I don't know. I don't see the. I should try not to go out in the world too much, which is probably a good thing, right? Because if I'm so grumpy about things, then it's probably good I don't see the world too much. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to. Back to the list of funds. Oh, wasn't I just here? Where's my list of funds? As you can see here, lots of different mutual funds are listed here for all different kinds of goals. Emerging Markets Equity Fund, we looked at that. Emerging Markets Debt Fund, Equity Index Fund, Green Bonds. It would be things like funding for like solar panels being built, et cetera, et cetera. High Yield Fund, that would mean like junk bonds. Inflation linked bond funds. You get the picture here of all the stuff that's going on here. Again, a wife, a client of my wife would come in and say, I love the environment. I want to give money. I want to invest in companies that help the earth be more sustainable. That green fund would be a perfect, expensive way to do it. Um, I'm looking for one thing here and I don't exactly see it. Here it is. So the other thing that's out there that's probably about 15 years old would be these life cycle funds. I absolutely hate these funds. Not that again, not you're taking this class to think like me, but you really should give thought to this. And especially if your parents or your grandparents are invested in this kind of thing, you should at least tell them what you're learning in this lecture. So the point of a life cycle fund, right? So we've got one here. Let's just look at one here. Life cycle 2025 fund right here. What this is saying is that if you were to buy shares in this, let's say I knew I was going to retire in 2025 and I just sold my house. Let's say I sold it for $1 million and I know I'm going to retire in 2025. What do I do with it? I could just hold it in cash, sure. I could invest it in the stock market, but that could be pretty risky. I could invest it in bonds, but like problem with bonds is I might not get the kind of return. So about 15 years ago, you start to get to develop these life cycle funds with the idea that the professional manager of this fund will allocate the money to be able to get you the highest rate of return, with the idea that in 2025 you would reach your goal and you would start to your retirement goal, and you would start to withdraw the money. So they're not trying to seek like long-term highest rate of return. They're trying to get a return that gets you the highest return at up until 2025. So that's 4 years away. What we would know is that if you're trying to maximize your return up to 2025, 4 years from now, you probably want to have some stock, but you don't want to have too much stock, because if the market went down by half, it's going to take years and years to recover. So you wouldn't want to be that heavy in stock. You'd want to have some stock to offset what presumably would be mostly bonds and or cash. Let's see what's inside it. It makes it sound like I'm picking on TI Craft, but they do the exact same thing as everyone else. So I don't want you to think that I'm picking on them. They're just as bad as everyone else. And I'm a member of it, so don't think that like I'm picking on someone that I don't have my money with. They are still a third, almost 40% in US equities, 16% in international equities. So that's basically over 50% still in stocks. Everything else is bonds. That's a 50, let's just call it 50-50. That's a 50-50 allocation between bonds and stocks for something that you're going to be withdrawing the money 4 years from now. Don't think that's what people thought they were getting into, that the money would be relatively safe and immune from large market fluctuations. Yet people are buying this fund and basically they're still 50% in stocks. I don't think that that's what people thought they were getting into. And the thing is, I'm looking at the 2025 fund. I'm just waiting for it to. So I'm looking for the retirement fund again. See, these are in the retirement class of funds because what they do is they also appeal to people who save through their employer through like a 401k or a 403b, and they use these life cycle funds because the employee, doesn't give thought to what they want to invest in. Let's look at something like around my retirement age. Let's see, when would I be retiring? I don't usually think of it. So 20, 40, 2 years, 2025. Okay, so maybe I'd be retiring in like 2040, let's say. Let's say I retire early. 2040 fund. Basically 80 to 85% equities. Everything's on the table. Basically, everything is in equities. Did I really need a life cycle fund to do that? I mean, did I? Let's look at what specifically it owns. Most of this, so now what you see is that these life cycle funds are basically a mutual fund of mutual funds. It basically owns a series of mutual funds. Wouldn't it be better just to like buy these underlying things rather than paying even more to own this life cycle fund? How much more am I paying? An extra almost close to 1%. And I'm still going to have to pay the underlying expenses of the underlying funds. It's an even more expensive way of owning an investment. Okay, well, I'm sounding pretty negative about mutual funds, so I'm sorry here. Let's let's proceed. Mutual funds are all regulated. They're regulated by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They regulate the structure of the mutual funds. They regulate the cash holdings, how they advertise, the disclosures that are made to investors. All investors are entitled to receive a prospectus. I can't tell you the number of clients that my wife has that do not read their prospectus, have no idea what they're getting into. And again, fortunately, my wife's not a crook that's like screwing them over, but she certainly sees enough clients that are coming from a crook, and then she's got to basically talk to them about how they basically got screwed over by the previous person. It kind of sucks. Um, it is full, unfortunately, the industry is full of a lot of snakes. Now you've got closed-end funds and open-end funds. Let's start first with the open-end funds. Open-end funds are basically unlimited in number of shares issued. They basically will just keep, buying the assets that allow them to issue more and more shares. These mutual funds in general do need to hold some cash because people do make redemptions at points in time. And these mutual funds do need to make certain investments from time to time. But for the most part, an open-end mutual fund is not going to place any limits on how much you buy. So again, we've already talked about most of these here. But as you saw on that pretty long list on the TIAA-CREF website, you've got equity funds that basically are invested in stocks of various kinds. Large cap, meaning a large market capitalization, mid cap, a sort of middle of the road market capitalization, and small cap, those companies that have a small market capitalization. Bond funds, you've got federal bonds, state bonds, corporate bonds, and international bonds. Hybrid funds need to be things like an income fund, like a social choice fund, money market funds, that's basically cash. Actually, TIAA-CREF has some expensive, but interesting options here. Again, I'll say it again. I'm picking on them, but they're not the worst culprits in general. I've certainly seen worse. That's just the one that gives you the most information, which might be why they're not the worst. Um, there we go. The TIAA-CREF Social Choice Low Carbon Equity Fund. So this would be basically a client saying, I want to own stocks in companies that reduce their carbon footprint and have a good social consciousness. Okay. You can tell I would not be a good person for my wife's job. What are you going to pay for it? You're going to pay about 0.5% for, what's it even invested in? It's all equities. Microsoft, Google, Tesla, Nvidia. I mean, dude, I don't know what their carbon footprints are, but I don't know. Okay. I'm not sure if they qualify for. Again, most of these equity funds, these are oriented around individuals that are going to be investing for a significant amount of time, typically longer than 10 years. But again, we saw that 2025 fund still had 50% equities. Again, that's why I critique those target date funds, because they're just not, even as it says here, equity funds longer than 10 years. Most mutual funds do contain equities, most of the mutual funds out there. We got growth funds, aggressive growth funds, conservative growth funds. We got lots of different ways that people are getting their exposure to the stock market. But again, these are for new investors, investors that don't have time to manage their assets that much. These are expensive ways to get into things. So we talked about growth and income funds. These are kind of matching both equities and bonds. Sorry, okay, I'm back. He wanted to go explore outside. I don't know. We got equity and bond funds. Those kind of capture both your growth and income sides of the funds. You've got your income funds. These would be primarily investing in bonds, international equity. I mean, it kind of depends on, my wife and I, if we ever fight about anything, we fight about the desirability of global funds and equity funds, global equity funds. She's a strong believer that you need some exposure in your portfolio to emerging markets. I do not believe that you need that. And it's not because I'm like a xenophobe and I don't think that any of your investments should be outside the United States. Rather, it's that I think you can actually find some US equities that have a lot of international exposure that give you that kind of growth opportunity, but it's much easier to manage and you have much more knowledge about what you're invested in. An example being like Budweiser, Procter and Gamble, Coca-Cola, right, which have huge international presences, and you get all the kind of good and bad that comes from international investing by having exposure to those funds. Then you've got the type of mutual fund that I'm probably most exposed in, and that would be index funds. Index funds are incredibly inexpensive. I mean, technically they are mutual funds, but index funds are not actively invested. Rather, they just meet exactly the goal that That was my wife complaining about another advisor who had put someone into a fixed equity, a fixed annuity, basically locking the investor into a fund that paid 1% a year, and it locked that person into it for 10 years. So even if that client is unhappy with it, they basically have to pay a huge expense just to get out of that fund. Let's go back to where I was, index funds. This is where the vast majority of kind of pooled money that I have is. Let's look at it where it is. I'm not just trying to talk about what is trading invested in. That's not what I'm trying to talk about here. But the biggest place where people find these index funds are the low cost funds that are offered at Vanguard. Vanguard kind of basically made a name for itself by specializing in offering these index fund mutual funds. And I just wanted to give you an idea of the different funds that are out there. Can't just give me a big list of the funds, dude. So if you were to come to me and say, Shiting, I know I need to invest money. I want to do it. I want to be safe about it. I've got a pretty long time horizon to invest, but I don't want to pay a lot of expenses and I don't want to have to worry about it. What I would tell you is, let's find it here. I'd probably say you should buy the fund that I am in, and just leave it at that. And that would be this fund right here, the S&P 500 Exchange Traded Fund, ticker symbol VOO. Basically, you own all of the companies that are in the biggest market index out there, the S&P 500. So it's in the 500 basically biggest companies in the US. Look at that expense ratio, 0.03%. It's incredibly low cost. You've got diversity because you're spread across all 500 firms, large firms that are out there. And for that, look at that performance. That performance now is going to exactly match what the S&P 500 is doing, or get pretty darn close to it. 18.35 versus 18.4, 14.14 versus 14.18. I basically know that I'm exactly matching the S&P 500, and I'm paying very next to nothing to do it. And so look at that, a 10-year return, average annual return of 13, close to 14% a year, paying very little in funds. I don't have to chase returns here. It's an incredibly easy way, an inexpensive way to actually grow equity. It's just by buying this exchange traded fund offered at Vanguard. So I'm advertising here, but this doesn't need to be complicated, my friends. Then we've got our bond funds. Our bond funds, that would be the things where, like old people, or people that have been burned by the market before and they're incredibly averse to getting into anything. You're not going to make a lot of money on US treasuries, but you're going to really make the money on the corporate bonds. You could in other investment grade bonds. You really don't want to get into high yield bond funds. High yield bond funds, that's another way of talking about junk bonds. That would be non-investment grade. You really don't want that. That's right there. You can get some multi-sector bond funds if you're particularly interested in the debt in a particular sector of the economy. There are other bonds for certain government agencies, municipal bond agencies. So, for instance, I own a board of water supply bond, direct bond, not a bond fund. But I know that First Hawaiian Bank, they've created a mutual fund for Hawaii tax-free bonds. My wife sells their bond fund from time to time. And you've got your international and global bond funds. And again, your hybrid funds, we've already talked about this. The target date funds, I've already said I don't like them, but you don't have to care what I think. You also get these things called world allocation funds. These are if you're particularly interested in the growth in a particular area of the world, right? There's like an African fund out there. You can even get it for a particular country. So I am sure there's a fund out there for, well, I'm just going to pick a country and I'm picking this really at random. For Brazil, let's say. Well, it looks like there's at least some ETFs out there. What's this one? JP Morgan's actually got an actual bond mutual fund out there for this Brazil fund, equity fund. Again, I don't know anything about it. I'm just kind of reading this for the first time. But if you really like Brazil, I'm gonna guess it's pretty expensive to invest in. Yeah, you're paying 5% just to get into the fund, and then you're paying 1.8% every year. That's pretty darn expensive, really expensive. No, different strokes for different folks, right? Money market mutual funds. Probably a lot of you actually own this even at your local yokel bank. Right, if you want to earn a little bit of a higher rate of return, most checking accounts are actually in money market mutual funds. It's a mutual fund that's invested, right? And that's kind of this last part here. They're generally FDIC insured, and basically it's almost like cash, even though it's not cash. It's invested in things that are like cash, like short-term bond funds and whatnot. During the 2008-2009 crisis, a pretty big event happened where we basically broke the buck. And that was a very big deal because what it meant is that mutual funds, money market mutual funds, were no longer dollar for dollar. If you destroy this part of the market, most of the entire rest of the financial market in the United States crumbles. So, not for nothing. I don't know why they wait until slide 12 to talk about yes, they are. I would say this is very controversial. I've obviously come out on the side of these fees are in today's world, I'm not sure these fees are reasonable anymore. Mutual funds are expensive. They're expensive way to get exposure to the market most of the time. You've got front end fees. So when we just looked at that Brazil one, you paid 5% to get into the fund, and then you paid 1.8% or whatever it was, 1.5, I think it was 1.8% on an annual basis as an advisory fee. It's 7, right in that first year, you're going to lose 7% of your assets just to get into the fund. It's incredibly expensive. Sometimes people don't want to pay the 5% on the front end and they want to pay it on the back end, which you can do as well when you redeem the shares. Do you want to take your medicine now or take it later? I don't it's up to you. But these are expensive, and people don't, I think, often give enough attention to how expensive those annual fees are. Besides open funds, you've also got closed-ended funds. These are mutual funds that are only issuing shares when the fund was first created. And then basically what you see is that those funds, those shares can then trade in the secondary market and you can get higher values, but it's not going to be because the underlying assets are more important. And the exchange traded funds. Like this is the way now, I think, to build a portfolio. You can build an incredibly strong financial portfolio around well chosen exchange traded funds. In my opinion. And it's much, much safer than just going on Robinhood and buying 50 shares of GameStop. You can build a very strong portfolio around exchange traded funds. Now, another type of mutual fund that we don't talk too much about are hedge funds. And the hedge funds are incredibly risky. The hedge funds got a lot of talk in the 1990s. You need a lot of money to get into a hedge fund. It wouldn't be for me or really for anyone in this class, most likely. You have to have high net worth and be a seasoned investor to get into this. And usually there's a great deal of restrictions to getting out of it. When the GameStop thing happened, the biggest loser in the whole thing was a hedge fund that had invested in GameStop, was shorting it. And then when the stock value went up for GameStop because of what was happening on Reddit, then that hedge fund basically went bankrupt. Incredibly risky. Hedge funds generally can't have a great number of investors, and basically they are engaging in they'll buy like timber, they'll buy crazy assets that can go really big in value or fail spectacularly. These are popular in Hawaii, because Hawaii being what it is, but these are what are called REITs, real estate investment trusts. They basically invest in properties. They generally aren't subject to taxes, which is what makes them attractive to some. But they basically own real estate, and you, along with others, own this real estate. Okay, so I hope that gives you some exposure to mutual funds, which are an incredibly large part of today's financial market.